My friends, there are moments in history when the noise of politics fades and something deeper begins to speak. Not the voice of television, not the voice of social media, but the voice of warning. There are moments in history when everything seems normal on the surface, yet something deeper is stirring beneath it all. Nations go about their daily routines, people go to work, leaders make speeches, news cycles come and go. But sometimes, quietly, and almost unnoticed at first, a warning begins to echo through the events of that time. It is not always loud, it is not always obvious, yet those who pause and truly observe begin to feel that something significant is unfolding. History has shown again and again that great turning points rarely arrive without signals beforehand. Before empires fell, before societies transformed, there were moments that caused people to pause in disbelief. At first, many ignored them, some laughed at them, others argued about them endlessly. But later, when the dust settled and history looked back, those moments appeared very different. They looked less like coincidences and more like warnings that a nation had reached a crossroads. These warnings often come during times of deep tension. When people are divided, when voices grow louder but understanding grows weaker, when anger spreads faster than wisdom. In those seasons, events can unfold that shake people emotionally and spiritually. They force individuals to ask uncomfortable questions about the direction of their society, the condition of their hearts, and the values they have allowed to shape their lives. The truth is, warnings are rarely meant to bring fear alone. Their deeper purpose is to awaken. When people become too comfortable, too distracted, or too divided, a warning can break through the noise and demand attention. It reminds a nation that the path it is walking is not guaranteed to lead to peace or stability. It reminds people that choices matter, that attitudes matter, and that the spirit of a nation can shape its future more than any single event. Many times, when such warnings appear, the first reaction is shock. People say, "How could this happen?" Or "Why is this happening now?" The surprise itself reveals something important. It shows that many were not expecting a turning point. They believed things would continue as they always had. But history rarely moves in straight lines. It moves in waves, sometimes suddenly, sometimes dramatically, and when that moment of shock arrives, people often respond with strong emotions. Fear begins to spread, anger rises quickly, some blame others, some retreat into frustration or despair. But if we look deeper, we realize that the warning is not just about the event itself. It is about the response that follows. A warning can either divide people further, or it can cause them to reflect and reconsider their path. It can push society toward greater conflict, or it can become the beginning of humility and change. The difference lies not in the warning itself, but in how people choose to respond to it. This is why moments of warning carry such weight. They are not merely political or historical events. They are emotional and spiritual tests. They reveal the condition of a people's hearts. They show whether a nation will harden itself in anger or soften itself in reflection. And sometimes the most powerful warnings are the ones that leave everyone stunned, because in that moment of stunned silence, there is a rare opportunity, an opportunity to step back from the noise, to breathe, to reflect, and to ask a deeper question that many avoid in ordinary times. Are we willing to learn before the next chapter of history is written? There are moments in history when a single figure suddenly appears at the center of the world's attention, and everything changes. Not gradually, not quietly, but almost like a storm that rises on the horizon and sweeps across the landscape before anyone fully understands what is happening. The rise of Donald Trump was one of those moments that seemed to shake the political world in a way few had expected. For decades, politics had followed familiar patterns. Certain candidates were considered serious. Certain paths to leadership were seen as the only possible roads to power. Analysts, commentators, and experts believed they understood the system. They believed they could predict who would rise and who would fade away. But then something unexpected happened. A businessman who had spent much of his life in the world of real estate, television, and public controversy stepped into the arena of politics. Many people initially dismissed him. Some treated his campaign like a temporary spectacle. Others assumed it would disappear as quickly as it appeared. Yet, as time moved forward, something unusual began to unfold. Crowds gathered. Conversations grew louder. Supporters felt that someone was finally speaking the words they believed had been ignored for years. At the same time, critics felt alarmed, worried about the tone, the message, and the direction things might take. Emotions on both sides grew stronger with every passing week. The rise of Donald Trump was not just another political campaign. It became a moment that forced millions of people to confront their feelings about leadership, identity, and the future of their country. For some, his rise represented hope and change. For others, it represented uncertainty and fear. But what made the moment so powerful was not only the man himself, it was the reaction that spread throughout society. Friends debated late into the night. Families argued at dinner tables. Social media became a battlefield of opinions. Words were spoken that revealed deep frustrations that had been building for years. Suddenly, people were no longer just discussing policies or elections. They were expressing deeper emotions about who they felt heard them and who they believed had forgotten them. The election that followed in 2016 shocked many observers across the world. Polls had predicted one outcome. Experts had predicted another. Yet the result stunned countless people when Donald Trump became the 45th President of the United States. For supporters, the moment felt like a victory against a system they believed had ignored them. For critics, it felt like a sudden shift that brought deep concern about what the future might hold. The emotional reactions were immediate and intense, but beneath all the celebration, disappointment, arguments, and headlines, something deeper was happening. The rise of Donald Trump exposed the powerful emotions that already existed within the nation. It revealed divisions that had been quietly growing beneath the surface for years. It showed how differently people could see the same moment in history, one group seeing hope, another seeing warning. And perhaps that is why the moment felt so shocking to so many people. It wasn't simply about politics. It was about identity, trust, frustration, and the longing to be heard. People realized that the country they thought they understood was more complex than they had imagined. In moments like these, the story is never only about one person. It becomes a reflection of the entire society around them. A leader may stand at the center of the stage, but the emotions of millions of people shape the meaning of that moment. And when history looks back on such times, it often sees something deeper than the rise of a single leader. It sees a nation wrestling with itself, trying to understand its fears, its hopes, and the path it will choose moving forward. As the events unfolded and the political atmosphere grew more intense, something began to spread quietly but powerfully through the hearts of millions of people. Deep, complicated emotions that were difficult to control. The rise of Donald Trump did not simply create political debates. It stirred something far more personal inside people. It touched fears, hopes, frustrations, and wounds that had been building for years. Across the country, conversations began to change. What once might have been simple discussions about policies or elections slowly turned into emotional confrontations. People who had once spoken calmly with each other suddenly felt tension growing between them. Friends who had laughed together for years found themselves avoiding certain topics. Families sitting around the same dinner table realized that they were seeing the future of their country in completely different ways. For some people, the moment created excitement and confidence. They felt that change was finally coming, that someone had stepped forward who spoke boldly about issues they believed had been ignored for too long. Their emotions were filled with determination and hope, but for others the same moment produced anxiety and fear. They worried about the direction of the country, about the tone of public conversation, and about how society might change in ways they could not yet fully understand. Their hearts carried a heavy weight of uncertainty, and so two powerful emotional worlds began to exist side by side. One filled with hope, the other filled with concern, yet between those two worlds stood a growing wall of misunderstanding. Instead of listening, many people began reacting. Words were spoken quickly, sometimes harshly, without the patience to understand the feelings behind someone else's perspective. Social media amplified every disagreement. A single comment could ignite an argument that spread across thousands of screens within minutes. Anger became easier than empathy. Judgment became louder than curiosity. What made the situation even more painful was that many people were not truly angry at each other. They were carrying deeper fears about the future. Some feared losing their identity, their voice, or their place in society. Others feared the loss of stability, fairness, or unity. These fears were real, even if they were expressed in ways that sometimes hurt others. And when fear meets uncertainty, emotions can quickly spiral. You could see it in the way people spoke. You could hear it in the frustration in their voices. You could feel it in the tension that hung in the air during conversations. A nation that once believed it understood itself suddenly realized that its people were carrying very different experiences and emotions. Beneath political arguments were stories of struggle, disappointment, hope, and longing to be heard. The tragedy of such moments is not that people disagree. That has always been part of human society. The tragedy is when disagreement turns into hostility, when people begin to see each other not as neighbors or fellow citizens, but as enemies. And yet, hidden within this storm of emotion was an important truth. These feelings were not appearing out of nowhere. They were revealing things that had been buried for years, pain that had never been addressed, frustrations that had never been resolved, and fears that had never been spoken aloud. In many ways, the emotional division was like a wound finally being exposed to the light. It was painful to see, painful to experience, and painful to admit. But sometimes a wound must be revealed before it can ever begin to heal. The challenge for any society in such a moment is learning how to move forward without letting those emotions destroy its sense of humanity. Because when hearts become hardened by anger and fear, the distance between people grows wider and wider. But when people find the courage to pause, to listen, and to recognize the humanity in each other, even in disagreement, that is when the possibility of healing begins. And in the middle of all the shouting, the arguments, and the emotional storms, the quiet question remains for every person to answer. Will our emotions divide us, or will they push us to understand each other more deeply than before? When moments of great tension appear in a nation, people often focus only on the surface of what they see. They talk about elections, leaders, policies, and headlines. But sometimes the deeper meaning of such moments goes far beyond politics. Sometimes they become a wake-up call that reaches into the heart of a society and asks questions many people have been avoiding for years. The rise of Donald Trump created more than debates about leadership. It created a moment that forced people to pause and examine themselves, their communities, and the direction their country was moving. Whether people supported him or opposed him, very few could ignore the emotional shock that spread across the nation. Moments like this can feel overwhelming. The noise of arguments grows louder, the tension between people becomes heavier, and the future seems uncertain. But within that chaos, there is often a deeper invitation, an invitation to reflect. A wake-up call does not always come gently. Sometimes it arrives through disruption, through events that shake people out of their comfort and force them to look honestly at what is happening around them. It challenges people to ask questions they may have avoided when life felt more stable. Questions like, have we stopped listening to each other? Have we allowed anger to replace compassion? Have we become so divided that we no longer recognize each other's humanity? These questions can be uncomfortable, but they are necessary. A society cannot grow if it refuses to look at its own reflection. When a wake-up call arrives, the first reaction is often resistance. People blame others. They argue. They defend their positions fiercely. But if they pause long enough to move beyond the first wave of emotion, something powerful can happen. Reflection begins. People start to realize that the problems they see around them did not appear overnight. They were building slowly over time through misunderstandings, broken trust, and years of voices feeling unheard. What seemed like a sudden crisis was often the result of deeper issues that had been ignored for far too long. In this way, a wake-up call can actually be a moment of opportunity. It gives people the chance to step back from the endless cycle of reaction and truly examine the values guiding their lives. It reminds individuals that the strength of a nation does not come only from its leaders, but from the character of its people. If people choose humility, they can begin to rebuild trust. If they choose patience, they can begin to hear voices they once ignored. If they choose reflection instead of blame, they can start to heal wounds that once seemed impossible to mend. History has shown that some of the most powerful transformations begin during moments that initially feel like crises. What appears at first to be chaos can become the very moment that awakens a society to its deeper responsibilities. A wake-up call asks people to look inward before pointing outward. It reminds them that change does not begin in government buildings or political campaigns. It begins in hearts, in conversations, in the choices people make every day. And perhaps that is the true power of such moments. They remind a nation that its future is not written only by those in power, but by the collective spirit of its people. When people respond to a wake-up call with honesty and courage, something remarkable becomes possible. Division can turn into dialogue, fear can transform into understanding, and what once felt like a moment of shock can become the beginning of renewal. Because sometimes the most difficult moments in a nation's story are the very ones that open the door for its deepest growth. When emotions run high and the world feels divided, it is easy for negative feelings to take control of the heart. Anger can feel powerful. Fear can feel overwhelming. Frustration can slowly turn into bitterness. During times of political tension and uncertainty, especially during the rise and presidency of Donald Trump, many people experienced emotions that were difficult to manage. Some felt unheard, others felt misunderstood, many felt exhausted by the constant conflict around them. Negative emotions are deeply human. Every person experiences them at some point. But when those emotions are left unchecked, they begin to shape how we see the world and how we treat the people around us. A single moment of anger can lead to harsh words. A feeling of fear can turn into suspicion toward others. Over time, those feelings can build walls between people that seem impossible to tear down. The challenge during times of division is learning how to face those emotions without letting them control us. The first step toward overcoming negative feelings is honesty. People must be willing to admit what they are truly feeling inside. Pretending that anger or fear does not exist only allows those emotions to grow stronger in silence. But when someone pauses and honestly says, "Yes, I feel afraid," or "Yes, I feel angry," something important begins to happen. Awareness opens the door to healing. The second step is slowing down our reactions. In a world where messages travel instantly and arguments explode in seconds, people often respond before they truly think. Words written in anger can spread quickly and cause damage that lasts for years. But a moment of pause, a single deep breath before responding, can prevent pain that might otherwise follow. Sometimes the most powerful choice is simply choosing not to react immediately. Another important step is remembering that behind every opinion is a human being. It is easy to forget this during heated debates. People begin to see others only as opponents rather than individuals with their own experiences, fears, and hopes. But when we remember the humanity in others, our perspective begins to soften. We may still disagree, but disagreement no longer requires hatred. Compassion becomes possible again. Overcoming negative feelings also requires focusing on what we can control rather than what we cannot. No single person can control every political event or national decision, but every individual can control how they treat others, how they speak, and how they respond to challenges. Small acts of kindness, patience, and understanding may seem insignificant, but together they can slowly change the tone of an entire community. Another powerful way to overcome negativity is through reflection and gratitude. When people spend all their energy focusing on what is wrong, their hearts become heavy. But when they pause to remember the good that still exists, the relationships, the opportunities, the moments of peace, they begin to regain emotional balance. Hope begins to return. None of this means ignoring problems or pretending disagreements do not exist. Healthy societies need open discussions and honest debate, but those discussions must come from a place of respect rather than rage. When people learn to manage their negative emotions, something remarkable happens. Conversations become calmer. Understanding grows. Even in disagreement, people begin to recognize each other as fellow human beings rather than enemies. The truth is that moments of tension reveal the strength of a nation's character. They test whether people will surrender to their worst impulses or rise above them with wisdom and compassion. Overcoming negative feelings is not easy. It requires patience, humility, and self-control. But when individuals choose that path, they become part of something greater, the slow and powerful healing of a divided society. Every turning point in history eventually brings people to a moment of choice. After the noise of arguments, the shock of events, and the storm of emotions, a quiet question remains before a nation and before every individual. Asterisk, what will we do next? Asterisk, moments like the rise and presidency of Donald Trump did more than create headlines. They placed society at a crossroads where the path forward depended not only on leaders, but on the hearts of millions of people. A future is never written by one moment alone. It is written by the choices people make after that moment. When tension and division fill the air, it becomes easy to believe that anger will always dominate, that disagreements will only grow deeper, and that unity